Hi everyone, my name's Alex Howard. I'm a researcher with SARDI, and I was involved in this specific project, which was a review of rodent control for the Australian poultry industries. It was conducted in 2019 and finished early 2020, but is obviously still very relevant with some of the recent rodent population explosions that we've seen in the eastern states in particular. So today I'm just going to go through a few of the learnings out of that review, and then also just discuss the importance of good on-farm rodent control. Okay, so rodents are a feature of rural Australia, and unfortunately something that we just have to deal with. Now, within intensive animal production systems, rodents are associated with, among other things, the transmission of pathogens, animal welfare issues. They cause severe feed loss. They can be associated with contamination, and of particular focus for the poultry industry, they're implicated in salmonella and campylobacter contamination. And they cause, in huge numbers, when they're in that huge numbers as we're seeing recently, they cause huge amounts of structural damage through chewing of wiring and damaging farm infrastructure and things like that. And so really effective rodent control, it's got to be a key pillar of any farm's biosecurity strategy. Especially with the recent mouse plague that we've seen, control measures need to be carefully considered to avoid and minimize any further issues. So I thought I'd start by just explaining a bit. I mean, we've seen stories in the media, and I'm sure those of you on the ground have observed there's been a huge increase in the number of specifically mice in the eastern states, in Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland in particular. And what's caused that is increased autumn and winter rainfall in 2020, which has extended the breeding season for mice, which normally starts through spring. So mice are hugely prolific breeders. They reach sexual maturity very early at about 6 weeks of age. And they are capable of producing up to 11 litters. Of each litter would have 4 to 12 juvenile mice that they produce each year, and the peak breeding is in spring. And what happens when you have this extended rainfall events through autumn and winter is that this breeding season just gets extended, and this causes what we're seeing now, which is population explosion. Now, I know everyone's very interested to hear about rodent control and maybe what are some of the ways we can get around this. With a plague event like this, there's really nothing you can do. There are so many extrinsic factors that have caused this event. We've kind of just got to hold on for dear life until it ends. There are certainly things that we can do to manage rodent populations more effectively and safely. But this plague is likely to continue until July, when food just becomes scarce and the cold winter conditions really start to stress and bring down the population. But the fortunate thing is for producers is when these populations crash, they do very quickly. It can happen over a period of a couple of days to 2 weeks. So we just got to have some favorable conditions which depress the population and bring things back under control. So going back to the needs, where the need emerged for this review of rodent control, basically prior to the review, producers had some information that they could get from, your national farm biosecurity manuals, or maybe a specific company biosecurity protocol, or maybe some sort of on-farm pest control contractors that they had engaged. And these documents, I mean, they contained very broad recommendations, like, having bait stations placed at regular intervals, and number and mapping them, and checking them weekly, and recording inspections of activity and cleaning feed spills. But they're not very specific recommendations. They don't really tell you what products specifically you should be using, or what products you shouldn't be using, maybe which ones are outdated. They don't tell you if there are any that maybe aren't suitable for a specific type of operation. And if you have a specific problem with rats in particular, like how can you target rats specifically, none of these pieces of information really cut to the core of that and provide that level of detail. And so that's where we really identified that maybe there was some more information that producers needed. So we sort of designed this project. So the aim of the project really was to fill these knowledge gaps, provide some practical solutions. And we tried to achieve this through conducting a bit of a survey just to see what was going on the ground. The current use of rodenticides in particular focus to sort of capture these industry rodent control practices and maybe identify some risks or where things are going wrong. And then the second part was to do a literature review. Go out on the landscape, on the market, and just review all these products, see which ones are most suitable, which ones maybe are outdated, and attempt to provide and distill this information to provide some practical solutions for improving the management of rodents on farm. So that's really what we set out to do. So firstly, with the survey, we got some really good responses. We had around 55 responses from a combination of layer and chicken meat producers. Good overall coverage of the industry for a project of this kind. And what we really observed, which is probably no surprise to many of you, but 95% of producers encountered rodents daily. It's just a part of their life. Now, the three main species, as we know, are the house mouse, brown rat, and black rat, and they were the most commonly observed. And rodent-related damage was observed by 56% of respondents. So that's things like structural damage to your farm buildings or machinery, damage maybe to some electrical wiring being chewed through, varying levels of feed loss and scavenging, some disease incidents, although that's very difficult to specifically isolate as a cause by rodents, but certainly something that they were implicated in, and issues with contamination of feed and food products. So continuing, the most popular rodent control methods employed on farm. Now these total more than 100 because, as you may know, like you don't just choose one method. People are really throwing the whole book at it, trying to see what works. So multiple of these methods are being employed, but basically the most popular method of dealing with rodents is using anticoagulant bait. So 81.8% of producers using that. Then 38% attempted to rodent-proof their farm facilities by placing sort of seals on pipes and doors, trying to prevent access through various farm facility design, constructing concrete retaining walls to prevent burrowing, things like that. And 23% use some sort of mechanical traps or glue boards to sort of supplement their baiting program. This one's interesting. 16% used what's called a bare earth policy, where they're completely removing any sort of rubbish around their shed and production facilities in particular, and making sure that they keep weed and silage really short, mown really short to prevent any sort of harborage or habitat protection for mice. And then various other things like using baits that people don't even know what the active compound were, which was a bit alarming. And then some other non-anticoagulant bait options, all the way down to no control, very small minority. And these people didn't have any issues with rodents just due to the nature of where their production facility was located. So lucky them. Continuing, practices were highly variable. There was really no one-size-fits-all approach, as you would expect. Some used just secure bait stations. Some used some less secure methods, like putting bait in brown paper bags or putting them under pallets and things like that. The level of bait station checking and replenishing frequency really varied based on the level of activity. There was no best practice sort of model for an approach here. And despite all this, producers really rated their programs highly, although they were sinking all these resources into it. And despite the level of ongoing rodent activity they were observing, they generally believed that they were sort of doing the best they can and were doing a really good job. Although some did sort of report to us that they could see potential risks with an over-reliance on baiting going forward. So the second part of the project was a review of rodent control literature. We looked at over 485 scientific papers with things to do with rodent ecology and behavior, available and emerging products. And we developed what we called a rodenticide product manual, which is basically a sort of compendium of all of the anticoagulant rodenticides and all other rodenticides that are registered by the APVMA. And we went through their mode of action, permit use requirements, secondary poisoning risk, to level of toxicity, things like that. And the aim of that was really, as I said, to provide practical solutions for improving the management of rodents on farm, sort of cut through all the marketing spin, which is around your rodenticide use. So yeah. So firstly, we started with looking at how we can identify rodent species. And there are three main rodent pest species important in relevant to poultry operations. So you've got your black rat, your brown rat, and your house mouse. And each of these have unique set of physical features and behavioral sort of adaptations which you actually need to take into account when you're designing your rodent control program. For example, your black rat, which you see there on the right, it can be identified. It's got a tail that's shorter than its body. It's a more slender build, and it's actually quite an agile animal. It climbs and burrows in roof cavities, roof spaces, whereas your brown rat, which is a lot thicker and has a shorter tail than its body, that's the one that burrows underground. And you'll often see, if you walk around the external perimeter of your sheds, you'll see these little burrows. It's burrowing in under your facilities there. And then mouse, obviously people can identify mice, really small body, really big ears relative to their head. They're generally a nuisance, but as we see, when they're in plague proportions, they can cause some real issues. And so the importance here is really, before you go about tackling your rodent problem, you need to identify what predominant species are we dealing with. Are we dealing with some burrowing brown rats, or have we got a black rat infestation in our roofs? And other little things, like, in general, mice are really stupid. They will eat anything. So you put out bait, they will just not even question it. They'll start to consume it. Whereas rats are a little bit more crafty. They actually test poison before committing to eating it. So they nibble a little bit of it and sort of see what happens, and things like that. So those are sort of the things you need to consider. And we actually developed a bit of a fact sheet, which is available through AgriFutures Extension Oz website, which helps to assist with identifying your rodent species. It's one of those things that people just sort of tend to overlook, but it actually is quite important to increasing the chance that your rodent control efforts will succeed. The other things we talk about, anticoagulant or rodenticides, as I mentioned, they're the most popular and widespread type of rodenticide that's used. How they work, they disrupt blood clotting and they lead to hemorrhage in the rat. Now, not all anticoagulant rodenticides are equal. They have varying potency, which basically means there's a varying amount of each bait that the target rodent has to eat before it consumes a lethal dose. And critically with these compounds, they don't work overnight. They have a delayed onset of symptoms. And that's important because, as I mentioned before with rats, they don't commit to consuming bait straight away. If a bait causes them to feel ill immediately, they will completely avoid it, and then that's no longer going to be effective. So these compounds were designed to have a bit of a delayed trigger effect, so the animal continues to consume them and then ultimately consumes a lethal dose before the symptoms start to appear. But it's got a flip side to that. What that essentially means is that you might not see an immediate change in the population when you put out these baits, and you might be thinking, oh, they're not working. There is that delayed up to 22-day time period before it starts to get through the generations and generations of rats on your compound. So we have different classes of anticoagulants. We've got first generation, which were your early compounds developed in the 1950s. So it's warfarin, cametrolil. Now, these compounds are still on the market, but they're actually quite outdated. They're quite poor in terms of their level of toxicity. You also have your second generation, your brodifacoum and your bromadiolone, which are much more potent, but they're also much more persistent in the environment. So, I mean, like anything, there's advantages and disadvantages. You can use these more potent compounds and they're going to be more effective, but there's also some increased risk of sort of secondary poisoning, and potentially we've seen the accumulation of anticoagulant residues in food and animals and things like that. So there's just things you need to consider. Like any poison, it's a dangerous chemical that needs to be handled with care and used appropriately, not just used sort of willy-nilly. So as we sort of mentioned, Kylie mentioned, there was last year some AVPMA action on anticoagulant rodenticides just because of these risks. And there's a general, in the global community, like scientific community, that there's increasing scrutiny on use of these compounds. Jurisdictions around the world are really taking action and looking to clamp down on use of these projects in some environments. Now, APVMA conducted a review, and many of the livestock industries, including the poultry industries, made submissions which highlighted the importance of having these measures, because they do effectively control rodents, and they are necessary because the consequences of poor control of rodents are just too severe to completely, not be avoiding using these compounds. But it's important, these submissions also acknowledge that there are risks associated with anticoagulant use, They need to be used properly and carefully, and there needs to be some clear guidelines and labeling specifically around that. So it's not yet clear what's going to come out of this review, but we have some sort of indicators. We know there's going to be some more clear labeling requirements. There's going to possibly be some cross-industry stewardship programs, but we'll just wait and see. And if we look at other markets, so the EU, I know, have a trialing products with reduced, they're halving the active concentration of products, which is slightly concerning because you could be getting into a situation there where you're still using these compounds, but maybe they're not as effective as before. But they have all sorts of other issues with the emergence of resistance and things like that. So we just kind of have to be aware that there is, going forward, most likely going to be some increased regulation of these compounds. Now, in terms of literature review, also covers non-anticoagulant rodenticides. So you have your vitamin D3 rodenticides. Advantages: it has reduced secondary poisoning and residue risk. It also has that delayed onset, which is a good feature at preventing bait avoidance. But critically, it's not as potent. It's not as effective. So what that basically means is the mouse or the rat has to consume more of these compounds to get a lethal dose, and that can be tricky in a farm environment where you've got lots of other tasty food sources available for rodents. But it is an option there if you're particularly concerned about the risks. And then you have zinc phosphide, which is your nuclear option for plague proportions. It's highly potent and it causes very rapid onset of symptoms and rapid death in rodents. It does have a high risk of secondary poisoning because it's an acute poison, so it needs to be really carefully used, and there are some permit use requirements around it. And also, you might think that the rapid onset of symptoms and a rapid kill would be a really good thing, but if you use it for too long, you can cause bait avoidance, as I mentioned before. So it's really your nuclear option for when you really need a quick burst, a quick clear out of the population. So just sort of wrapping up, I know everyone sort of wants to hear, what's the silver bullet? There is no silver bullet. Controlling rodents, requires a multifaceted approach. So I would say stick to the basics, identify your species that you've got, select an appropriate rodenticide for that species. We have that sort of information in the rodenticide product manual, which is available through the AgriFeatures website. Don't neglect your facility upkeep would be a really big thing. Yes, baiting is necessary, but other things like cleaning up rubbish, feed spills, making sure that grass around your sheds is nice and mown and is clear, kind of a clear path which dissuades rodents from migrating from shed to shed. It's a really simple thing that can make a really big difference. And I would say the other thing is just try a few different things to monitor levels of rodent activity over time and adjust your rodent strategies accordingly. Keep records of visual observations or the level of bait intake or how many you might be trapping, just so you can get a sense of whether or not you're succeeding or whether or not maybe you need to change things up. And reach out for help if you do need or if you are struggling with your baiting programs. It can be good to get some other perspectives on that. So really that's everything. Happy for people to reach out to me if they'd like some additional information or just to have a chat. My contact details are there, but thanks for listening, and